Hey everyone, let me ask you a quick question. What comes to mind when I mention the words standard fantasy setting? If you're like me, then the first thing that pops into your head is probably a fictional world based on medieval Europe, in a feudalistic society that never advances to the point where gunpowder weapons are invented, no matter what year or century it is. If there are any races besides humans, there will probably be elves, dwarves, orcs, and maybe some goblins. If goblins and orcs aren't the same thing, like they were in Tolkien. One of the reasons I started writing fantasy is because I got a bit fed up with the fact that I can ask you what the standard fantasy setting is, and you probably already have an answer. I don't have a problem with medieval fantasy, but the very idea that fantasy can be pigeonholed like this is a problem. Even most of the modern romantic fantasy women are obsessed with on Book Talk are tied to this medieval European setting in some way. Granted, when it's something like A Court of Thorns and Roses, the Fae originate from English myth and legend, so in that case it's kind of a requirement. But it's everywhere these days. And I know Hollywood has no creativity left anymore, but you'd think with how obsessed they've been with diversity, they'd at least try to come up with a fantasy show set somewhere other than medieval Europe. But then you look at how much this style of fantasy has spread to other cultures. Why are there so many manga and anime that draw so much inspiration from medieval fantasy? It's not like the Japanese didn't have their own feudal period to draw inspiration from. The concept of elves didn't even exist in Japanese culture before the last century. Some of this, as I'm sure you've already guessed, is just down to laziness. People with no creativity just use the fantasy worlds that are already tried and tested because it's easy. But that can't be the only explanation. Can you really call the Wheel of Time series a Tolkien ripoff? What about the Chronicles of Prydain? Sure, they take place in a medieval fantasy setting, but the similarities end there. Some of it has to do with efficiency. When you create a story, you have to split the audience's time between the plot, the world building, and the characters. You usually get enough room to do two of those things really well. Trying to get all three usually results in the audience getting bored, or your story becomes too bloated, and you end up having to split a book into two parts because people don't want to read a book that's over 700 pages. I learned this the hard way. Relying on a setting that people are already familiar with lets you make more room for the story you want to tell and the characters you want to fill it with. But aren't there some other story settings we could rely on? Why not a fantasy set in ancient Rome? Or a high fantasy story around the events of the First World War? Where's the Lord of the Rings equivalent set in the age of piracy? Why does it always have to be Europe, and why this specific period in history? Well, there are a few reasons. First, fantasy stories have more or less been set in this period while it was still going on. As in, people in the Middle Ages wrote all manner of their own heroic fantasy tales set in their own time period, with the Arthurian legend being the best example. Mind you, the Arthurian tales were never a fully organized collection of stories. It's more of a mythos than an actual legend. One of the earliest written compilations of Arthurian tales was made by a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who gives us the basics of characters like Arthur, Merlin, Guinevere, and Mordred, but Geoffrey lived between 1095 and 1155, so his account would have been published at least 400 years after the events of this story allegedly took place. And that's if you submit to the theory that Arthur is based on any real historical figure. Now, by his own accounts, Geoffrey was not the author of these stories, but merely compiling the tales that were told by word of mouth from this time. So these legends had been around before, they just weren't written down. However, only a few decades later, we get a French poet with a name I can't pronounce who starts writing fan fiction about Geoffrey's version of Arthurian tales, which includes his super cool OC Lancelot, the bravest of the knights, who's super unbeatable and all the ladies love him, and he ends up winning Guinevere instead of Arthur. Do not steal. Yeah, Lancelot is a fanfiction self-insert by a French poet, which means people were writing things about Arthurian legend that they didn't actually believe to be true during the Middle Ages themselves. In some, they were writing their own fantasy literature. Fanfiction, maybe, but still fantasy, not history. Mind you, European technology, culture, and basically everything else hadn't advanced that much between the estimated time of King Arthur in the 7th century and the time that Geoffrey and French Gary Stew were published. 400 years seems like a lot of time to us, because 400 years ago people didn't even have steam power. But in the European Dark Ages, most of Western Europe was trying to get back to the way things were under Rome, not really making any progress or anything new. Eastern Europe was another matter, of course, but there's another key element that changed between the time of King Arthur and the time that people started writing about him. See, Arthur and Camelot are based in some form or another off of England in the Dark Ages of Europe, when most of the Christian world wasn't in Europe. At this point in time, 3/4 of Christendom was spread out across North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, and the Middle East. Most of the infidels that Arthur and his knights occasionally fought in the legends were European pagans, not Muslims. When I went to Egypt, I learned that the Coptic Christians that are still around pride themselves as being inheritors of the world's first Christian nation, and in the 6th century, Egypt was arguably the heart of the Christian world, and Islam conquered Egypt around 639 to 642. Arthurian legend is usually set between the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 6th, which means the story is, or at least was at the time of Geoffrey's work, supposed to have taken place back when Egypt and North Africa were still under Christianity. You might have been told in school that the fall of Rome was partly caused by the rise of Christianity. This is demonstrably false, as the eastern half of Rome, the part that became the Byzantine Empire, they survived the collapse, and they were the ones under Constantine who made Christianity their official religion. Meanwhile, the western half of Rome didn't become Christian until after the fall. Part of why the Dark Ages are estimated to take place between the 5th and 10th centuries is because not only did Europe collapse into chaos after the fall of Rome, but the things that actually did bring some kind of order and stability to the fledgling nations that rose out of Rome's ashes were suddenly knocked down by an entirely new religion, which meant that in the eyes of Christians in Western Europe, the Dark Ages literally felt like the end of the world. It's also around this time that a lot of the best stored collections of knowledge from the world prior to the fall of Rome were conquered by the growing caliphate. A common myth you might have been told in school was that the Muslim world preserved all of this knowledge after Christians let it fall out of their hands. The reality is that Muslims were the ones who grabbed it out of Christians' hands in the first place, and while they did preserve some of it, they also destroyed a lot of it. Which is incredibly frustrating for a history nerd like me. If I sound like I don't have a high opinion for the Muslims who did this, that's because I don't. So, we have a collapse of a previous civilization that fell into decadence. We have people trying to carve some sort of life that might be deemed normal out of the ruins of the old world. Order has been replaced by barbarism. No one's really sure what happened that caused the world to get like this, and there's a very distant but very evil-sounding empire emerging a long ways away. Wait, am I describing the Middle Ages or the Fallout universe? This is starting to sound more and more like a post-apocalyptic setting. Well, that's mostly because it was. To the average Christian living in Europe prior to the Crusades, it genuinely felt like an age of darkness. It's also called the Dark Age because there weren't a lot of written records kept at that time, which means we're in the dark regarding the specific details of what actually happened. A lack of written records means anything within reason could have happened during those days. And the fact that the Middle Ages are a time when humanity knew that a better, more advanced, more civil society did exist, but is gone now, is an important part in all of this. The fall of Rome was the first time in recorded history that an empire collapsed almost entirely because of its own internal problems, ranging from corruption in the government to the decadence of its citizens. This isn't always a component in fantasy settings, but it is surprisingly common. Notably, it's even common in Japanese media, and Japan didn't even have a Dark Age in their history. But the concept of there being a great, more advanced civilization that fell apart for some reason is a plot point in a wide range of fantasy works, to the point where it's an essential piece of background lore for Berserk, and it's ultimately the reason for the entire plot of Dungeon Meshi. But in addition to the typical tropes we associate with the post-apocalyptic genre, there's something else going on here. In many medieval fantasy settings, there's a trend of magic coming back, after it had been gone for a period of time. There's a number of ways to look at this, but in real life, after the fall of Rome, people across Europe became more religious, to the point where even the parts of Europe that weren't Christian before would eventually come under the sway of organized religion, whether by choice or by conquest. Eventually, Europe became a Christian continent, with the church being the ultimate authority above the crown. And it wasn't just Christianity either. A lot of old superstitions came to the forefront over time that people in Rome had forgotten about. When things like the government or the scientific experts of your society either become lost to you, or they become demonstrably corrupt to the point where everyone can see it, it's really common for people to turn to a religion as a new expert to trust on matters you don't know much about yourself. There's too much going on in the world for you to know everything, and so you have to outsource your knowledge and understanding on other things. Today, we have sayings like, trust the experts, and trust the science. We trust in things like election results, because obviously each individual person can't go and count the votes cast in every ballot box. We trust our elders, because they supposedly have wisdom that we don't and can guide us through the trickier parts of life. But what if all of those things turn out to be compromised in some way? Who are we to turn to when we find out that our scientists or our media experts with their prestigious reputations, or even our own grandparents, have been deliberately lying to us for years or even decades? What then? Returning to superstition, whether it's paganism or something more organized, is a common response to the collapse of trusted institutions, and things were no different back in the Dark Ages, almost identical to the trope as it appears in a lot of post-apocalyptic media today. The Shannara Chronicles, first published in 1977, is probably the pioneer of this trend of magic coming back after an apocalypse. Although it looks like a classic medieval fantasy setting on the surface, it's actually Earth after nuclear Armageddon, and people discover old magic from before the days of the modern world. Obviously, there are other examples, such as superstitious tribals in the Fallout universe, or the 1977 film Wizards, or even Adventure Time. All have some form of magic that has become more prevalent after a nuclear war. Granted, in Fallout, it's often deliberately ambiguous as to whether some of these things are actually magical, but in some cases, particularly whenever the Dunwich Company is involved, it's less open-ended. And maybe the trope where magic comes back deserves its own video, but that's for another day. But with the return of magic comes the return of magical creatures. The Dark Ages offers an entire toy box of fun things that you can throw into a setting, and it's not like you're necessarily limited to the stuff that people actually believed in back then. Tolkien certainly didn't. Orcs don't show up anywhere in medieval literature, or in any fairy tales or other stories from that time period. He seems to have actually derived the idea in part from the Oni of Japanese mythology, and partly off of the medieval understanding of demons in Christianity. Meanwhile, goblins, which Tolkien admits are basically the same things as orcs in his literature, called something else by the dwarves because they have a different language, are radically different from the way that they were portrayed in classic fairy tales. They're no longer tricksters, pests, or thieves, but soldiers in a genocidal army. The only real requirement for adding your own creativity to a medieval fantasy is that the things you add would have to fit with the general requirements of the setting. If you start throwing aliens into King Arthur's court, it becomes a different type of story altogether. So in the Middle Ages, people abandoned their old institutions for the church, and eventually that included nobility. And that leads me to the final big reason why we obsess over medieval fantasy. Part of why the western half of Rome collapsed was because of corruption in the Senate. For a while, people thought they could vote their way out of the collapse, but when it became clear that nothing would work, people lost faith in democratic governments altogether. This is part of why they were so willing to accept nobility and feudalism in the Middle Ages. The idea behind feudalism, in some capacity, is that the guy who brings order out of chaos gets to be the first king. See Arthur for an example. And his knights, who protect the realm from invaders and barbarians, got a privileged status as a reward. Unlike the Republic of Rome, which became a government of bureaucrats who faced no immediate consequences for their bad decisions, kings and knights who started wars had to go off and fight in them. At least that's the theory. While this didn't always play out in practice, one thing that did happen was that lower-ranking civilians who fought bravely could earn rewards. It wasn't uncommon for a mercenary to actually earn a title and be granted land for his service. Sure, you couldn't become king this way, but there were options for upward mobility. And during this period of time, war was different than in the modern day. The idea that war is glorious comes from the time when men faced each other down on a battlefield. During World War I, the British actually invoked Arthurian legend to get more men to join the army, on the grounds that this was their chance at glory. And then the reality hit that warfare was more about blowing people up from a long distance away with artillery than charging into battle on a horse like a knight. In fact, cavalry were used in World War I, but they got slaughtered. Part of the appeal of medieval fantasy settings is that there is no artillery. No one's getting blown to bits by bombardments in a trench. Wars today are organized by officers safe inside an HQ building, while the ground troops get slaughtered. Now it's moving even away from that, where drones are used instead of soldiers. War isn't glorious anymore like it was in the Middle Ages because we've stripped all of the humanity out of it. Sometimes literally. And coming back to the issue of governance under feudalism, there are good parts of feudalism that people recognize, where a good king who fights for his people is shown to be the gold standard. And there are bad parts to feudalism that people can easily criticize, most of which have a lot in common with the bad parts of any form of government. If the main advantage of feudalism is that the people who start wars are expected to be the ones to fight in them, and that the people who protect the nation are placed in charge, then a corrupt form of feudalism would be one in which the kings and nobles sit at home, conscripting the peasants, and making the people fight for them instead. Or, more commonly, there are examples where the lord or some other noble is overtaxing the peasants and making everyone too poor to survive. You might notice that there's a lot of overlap in the ways that these medieval governments become corrupt and the problems with modern governments. Every type of government might have its own benefits, but they all go crooked the same way. I also find it ironic that Arthurian legend was used as propaganda by militaries of World War I for how it portrayed the nobility fighting for their nations, and it ended up being the war that killed the concept of nobility for most of Europe. So yeah, That's why the Middle Ages ended up being the standard fantasy setting for so many people. Between the efficiency of relying on a world people are already familiar with, the earliest example of a post-apocalyptic setting, the wide choice of fantasy ingredients you can add to the basic medieval recipe, and romantic nostalgia for a time when nobleness obliged actually meant something, like it or not, this is peak efficiency. And these concepts manage to bleed out into other cultures as well. As I said before, Japan has no qualms about taking these ideas and running with them. That said, Japan has put their own twist on various elements, particularly elves. And when it comes to orcs in Japanese media, this is a case of a myth coming around full circle. A creature inspired by the Oni of Japanese mythology is now reimagined in all sorts of new ways by the very same culture that created the original. Of course, just because medieval fantasy settings have everything you need for a good story, that doesn't mean every work that uses it is going to make use of the options available, and it also means that there's a sea of mediocrity out there. And that brings me to today's featured game, Rise of the Dark Tower. It's a roguelike, similar to games like Hades and Realm of Ink, but set in a medieval period with a knight, skeletons, a succubus, and some of the most obvious beta I've ever seen in a roguelike game before. Okay, to be fair, there are attempts at giving some of these characters enough of a personality to keep it interesting, but the core gameplay is literally move, dash, and slash, and nothing else. You know how in Hades you have a main attack, a special, and a casting attack to start with? And all of the good copycats have kept at least some of those elements? There's a reason for that. Giving your players more options than one attack button is part of what makes a roguelike fun. In this game, the only things that change every time you die is what kinds of gear you can find, and none of them add much flexibility or require you to alter your playstyle in each run. Bottom line, I wasn't impressed. I'll keep an eye on this game when the full version comes out, since it's still just a demo on Steam, but I'm not expecting much. Alright, that's all I have for today. Thank you all, and goodbye.